Good evening. I'm Steve Weberg. I'm with the public affairs staff of the Kansas City Public Library, and I want to thank you all for joining us again this evening. And I think I saw a few of you coming in the door. I wanted to offer a quick apology for our lack of a reception tonight. We hope you're not too disappointed. It was we ran into a scheduling glitch on our end, and I guess you could say we lacked the military precision and preparedness of our partners at the Command and General Staff College. We'll make sure we get that shored up by the next time that we're together, and we appreciate your understanding. Besides, we know you're not here for the cheese and crackers, maybe the wine a little bit, but not the cheese and crackers. We're resuming our terrific Hollywood versus History series tonight in collaboration with the Command and General Staff College. And we've been waiting for this presentation, waiting to hear John Hosler talk about the Crusades and the historical accuracy of the film Kingdom of Heaven for a good while now. Our original intent actually was for John to kick this series off back in January. But our schedule got scrambled in part by the pandemic, and John was kind enough, and you guys have been kind enough to stick with us. And so this evening is the reward. Thank you, John, and thank all of you all for your patience with that as well. And we've got 3 scheduled installments left in this series. Now through late June, we'll spotlight Dr. Strangelove, Glory, and The Best Years of Our Lives. And the latter is kind of a special look at the role of the film industry in the U.S. involvement and the reaction to being involved in World War II. And working with Chris Johnson, who's a team leader in the Department of Military History at the college, who actually came to us with the idea for this series. We've made plans to extend the series well beyond June. We'll look at the historical accuracy of at least 6 more military movies. Should take us through the end of the year, and we hope you'll continue to stay with us. And you can always go to our website, kclibrary.org/events, and keep up with our updates on that. Kingdom of Heaven, directed by Ridley Scott and released in 2005, revolves around the Crusades, and it captures the just brutal conflict between Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land in the late 12th century. And there aren't many, if any, better guides to that particular period in our history than John Hosler. John's a professor of military history at the Command and General Staff College who specializes in medieval warfare, politics, and religion. He's a past president of the De Re Militari, the Society for Medieval Military History. And he's a trustee of the U.S. Commission on Military History. John spoke at the library back in 2018. It was about his book, The Siege of Acre, which won the Verbruggen Prize as the year's best book on military history. And he's due for a new book, I think it's in November, Jerusalem Falls, 7 Centuries of War and Peace. And it's the first full account of the struggle for Jerusalem from the 7th to the 13th century. We have an expert on the subject here. John has a master's degree in history from Iowa State and a doctorate in European history from the University of Delaware, and he's taught at the Command and General Staff College since 2017. I want again, before we start, to extend our gratitude to the late Jerry Rosenblum, whose memory we present this program and this Hollywood versus History series. It's made possible by a generous gift from his estate. Now we'll have time for a few questions at the end, and we ask those of you who are here to use one of the microphones that we'll place up front near the end of the program. We're also live streaming tonight, and those of you who are with us virtually, if you've got a question for John over the course of his presentation, you can drop it into the YouTube live chat box, and we'll try to get to it too at the end. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like for you to please welcome John Hosler back to the library. John, it's great to have you here again.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back. Hollywood versus history. We're taking on movies, so I thought I would start with something appropriate. A little Shakespeare tonight. This is from William Shakespeare's rumination in the poem, The Rape of Lucretia. Time's glory is to calm contending kings, to unmask falsehood and bring truth to light, to stamp the seal of time in aged things, to wake the morn of sentinel the night, to wrong the wronger till he render right, to ruinate proud buildings with thy hour and smear with dust their glittering golden towers. Glittering golden towers of Hollywood. Get ready for me. Kingdom of Heaven, a movie I first saw several years ago. Any medieval movie that comes out, I'm very interested in, of course, and particularly movies about the Crusades that land smack dab in my period interest me tremendously. Unfortunately, like many academics in my area of study, when it did come out, there was some sighing and lamentations. Oh no, oh no, oh my goodness, those sorts of things. And so what I'd like to talk to you tonight about is some of those things. But I'm going to try to be as generous as I can, because most movies, I think, do have some things in them that are redeeming. They do get somewhere close to the truth. Art imitates life, and life sometimes gets it correct. And so what I'll talk about tonight are some things that are problematic with the movie, but in the second part, I'd like to talk about some things that really work in the movie. And whether intentionally or not, I think the actors and the producers and the director and everyone involved in the picture actually play a little role in putting out a very important message. And so I'll be interested to take your temperature of what you think about that as well. A movie that has some fundamental issues in the presentation of history, but nonetheless gets a broad theme about history essentially correct. Now, I'm not the first person to talk about Kingdom of Heaven. There are several other historians who have done this. You can find lots and lots of reviews. I've simply highlighted two of them for you. One by the late Dr. Jonathan Riley Smith, perhaps the greatest Crusades historian of all, lately departed, the University of Cambridge, who published a piece in the London Times with the headline, "Truth is the first victim." It's a loaded phrase, right? Goes on in that piece to mercilessly rip on the movie and to take it to task over and over again. Another piece came out in the National Review by Dr. Thomas Madden, who's not too far away at St. Louis University, Onward PC Soldiers, making the point that this was a version of history that had been in some ways cleansed to present a new reading on the past, in which the true good guys were highlighted, in this case being the armies of Islam, and the true bad guys exposed in all of their gore. Those would be particularly the Knights Templar, but also just in general the Christian leadership in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In these, you find such phrases as Osama bin Laden's version of history, right? So the kind of story that only a terrorist would love. Right? I'm not going to go that far. I will point to the Rotten Tomatoes score, 39% on the tomato meter, which means not too well received by the general public, right? So while the scholars take their pot shots and while people get quite upset about the presentation of history, just in terms of the way the movie flowed, the way the movie told its story, there was an awful lot of criticism about it. One of the main critiques you see centers on character development, that you just don't know as much about the characters as you might want to know. Who is this Balian of Ibelline? What drives him? Who was his wife who dies at the very beginning? All of a sudden they're burying the wife and nobody knows why. Later on you find out it was a suicide. That was one of the main considerations that a lot of people took the movie to task for. And what happened is, soon after the movie came out, they released the director's cut, which is an elongated version that added back in a lot of that character development. And I have student after student tell me in my Crusades elective Dr. Hosler, the director's cut is so much better. Watch the director's cut. Watch the director's cut, right? The director's cut does better job with the character development, but it unfortunately does not correct the history. It doesn't take out the problematic aspects. So what I'll be talking about today is not so much the development of the characters, but more about the historical elements. Okay? Another bit about this. I know this audience has seen several talks now on Hollywood versus history. Few of those movies have actually issued a DVD defending themselves against historians. In that director's cut, there was one of these 4 discs, Creative Accuracy, The Scholars Speak, in which the director admits that there's been a lot of criticism by historians, and what they do is bring in their own experts to defend various elements of the movie. So here it's really quite a debate we have going. The historians have criticized the movie. These scholars step in and defend the movie, and then I come out and I start it up all over again, causing more problems. Right? Now, they do an admirable job in this. I will point out, none of the scholars that they bring in are actual Crusades historians, but I'll leave that be for the moment. Right? And what I'll try to do is address things that they didn't quite get to in their responses. So there's the information on the movie, if you don't know. Written by William Monahan, directed most famously by Ridley Scott. And there's the description from the DVD jacket, director of Gladiator and Black Hawk Down. And so with that kind of a reference, you would expect a movie packed with action. Surprisingly, there is less action in the movie than you might imagine. The centerpiece of the movie, or what I think should be the centerpiece, is the famous Battle of Hattin, July 4th, 1187, in which Saladin famously destroys the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in one decisive battle. That battle gets very short shrift in the movie. You mostly see the battlefield afterwards. Right? So it may be action-packed, and there are some encounters where you have a lot of swinging of swords and a lot of physical exertion, but certainly not as much, I think, as some of his other efforts. That being said, you don't have to do nothing but battles to make a good movie. Right? Let's find out if this was a good movie. Now, to help you along and navigate, I provided some pictures of these actors and actresses, the cast of characters. All right? All of these, I will point out, are historical characters, actual people who lived in history, except for one. And unfortunately, it's Godfrey of Ibelin who sets up the entire movie in the beginning. Godfrey claims to be the father of Balian, bequeaths his estate to Balian, and that leads Balian to go to the Holy Land and to do these sorts of things, right? Balian is not son of Godfrey. Balian's real father was a man by the name of Barrisan, who was the Lord of Ibelin, and Barrisan had actually 3 sons, not just Balian. Balian did go on to become the Lord of Ibelin, and his other brothers went on to do other things. So we know who his father was, we know who this whole family is, and unfortunately, Liam Neeson is not one of them. It's too bad. Okay. The other character I would point to would be the one in the middle, the Hospitaller, who is cast very much as sort of the good member of the militant orders. So you have the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. The Templars, an order that is devoted to protecting pilgrims on the roads in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, particularly the road from the port of Jaffa to the city. The Hospitallers run a hospital inside Jerusalem, the Hospital of St. John, and admit everyone into that hospital who needs care. And so the movie, as I watched it, I felt there was definitely a spin, the idea being that the Hospitallers were good, talking about getting along, talking about the positive aspects of faith and religion, and the Templars were frauds, corrupt, murderers, those sorts of things. And that repeats kind of a common refrain you see in Crusade studies, that the Knights Templar were kind of lost their way, but the Hospitallers are doing good works. They're doing works of charity. They are praying, giving alms, fasting, and helping the less fortunate. It helps, I think, today that the Hospitallers are still around. If you didn't know that, they are still with us, except today we call them the Order of Malta. So they're still around doing their good works, whereas the Templars were brutally suppressed in the early 14th century. But otherwise, all real characters, We'll talk about Queen Sibylla, or Sybil, as one of my colleagues prefers to call her. Renaud de Chatillon, he's the bad guy, right? And then Saladin at the end, who I think most people walk away from this movie thinking that he is one of the supreme good guys, one of the fair people, Saladin the just, merciful, who does not wantonly kill people for military advantage. Right? So there they are. Those are the people I'll be talking about. Now, to guide you through my critiques of the movie, and remember, I mentioned there will be critiques, but there will be one item of praise at the end, so let's not forget that. Right? I've designed a system. Now, sometimes you see mistakes in movies that are just little happenstance things. This is the stuff that drives historians crazy. Well, they would say, oh, well, that's a Stuka dive bomber, but the tail is wrong, and it wouldn't have been painted that way. And the tire, that's a modern tire. Why is there a white wall on the tire? And those sorts of things, right? And I call those kind of the oops moments. Whoops, right? It's problematic. People will notice. I don't know that it's anything to get worked up about, but you look at it and you say, they could have done that a little better. Okay, so those are the oops. And then we have the what the. This just kind of, my reaction is, why? Why would you do that? Like, there's no reason to make that mistake. You went out on a limb and you did something wrong, and I don't understand what your reasoning was for it. It's not for good dramatic effect. It's just, what were you thinking? Right? Number 3, the oh no. These are the more difficult ones, because these are usually commentaries on broader issues. So this is where Ridley Scott is talking about Christianity versus Islam, and the meaning of the Crusades, and the meaning of Jerusalem, where there are some things that are just somewhat incorrect, that really cast a very different version of history in comparison to reality. And so those are the ones where you step back and you say, oh, wow, I can see why people were getting so upset about this and calling it Osama bin Laden's version of history. It's because of those sorts of things, the oh-nos, right? But at the end, aha, right? The smiling emoticon, right? This is good. And I will make the argument that that thing at the end almost overwhelms all of the bad things. That there is something great you can take away from this movie if you watch it in the right frame of mind. So what we'll do is we'll go through these various pieces, and you can decide for yourself how egregious they are. Maybe you see them and you say, oh, that's not that big a deal, Hosler, stop complaining about things. Or maybe you can see where I'm coming from. We'll start with the oops. Has anyone in the audience ever been to Jerusalem? Wonderful, right? So when you enter Jerusalem, you of course saw the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the purported site of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, towering on a massive hill as you enter the city. No. The old city of Jerusalem is not on a giant hill. I saw this, I said, what in the world? It reminded me of the Acropolis in Athens, right? You know, the giant scarp up there with an ancient temple, right? The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is actually on a very flat surface. This is taken from the Mount of Olives, and this is the Dome of the Rock here on the Temple Mount. And then you can see the earth kind of sways down and up a little bit towards the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but certainly not up on a huge mountaintop. Right? Now that's one of those things where you say, okay, if you've been there, obviously that is wrong. Right? I don't know why they decided to do it. It features the church most prominently. I could get into the architecture and the dome and how it's all kind of wrong, but my point here is that they're trying to elevate it for some reason as if this is the grand structure. And famously in the movie, Balian goes up to the Mount of Golgotha and is very unmoved by what's going on up there. Right? So I found it a little curious that you would get such a physical feature so wrong. It led me to wonder if anyone on the crew had been to Jerusalem before. I assume they have. So there must be a reason for this mistake. I call it an oops. It's not that big a deal, but it's one of those things you just kind of scratch your head. There was another one where the army of the kingdom is advancing along the eastern wall of Jerusalem. They're walking right next to the Dome of the Rock. And I'm sitting there thinking, that's the Kidron Valley. It's steep. I mean, it goes down like this. They used to just throw bodies down there instead of burying them. Nobody could walk along there. And here they are on a nice, almost a sidewalk, just trancing along. So it's just strange. The physicality of the city just seems to have been very problematic when they put it together, from my perspective. Now, this is something that somebody, layperson is not going to notice and probably won't much care about. It's just the prickly historians who care about these things. Right? Here's another one, though. the siege of Jerusalem. After the Battle of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, Saladin takes his army and goes on campaigns. Now, he's very smart about this when he does. Once he has destroyed the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the city itself is at his mercy. He can take it any time he wants. But Saladin knows that from a strategic perspective, this city does not matter. What really matters are the port cities on the Levantine coast. And so he marches to the Mediterranean, and one by one, he takes those cities back. Acre, Ascalon, Beirut, Sidon. He grabs as many of them as he can, because he knows as soon as news of this gets back home, what's coming down the pipe? Another crusade. And so he's blocking off the ports so that the Christians can't get back. It's only once he's taken those port cities that he moves on Jerusalem. He does it at his leisure, really. There's a garrison defending it. There's not much they can do to protect the city, and he can attack it for as long as he wants to. Right? But how did Saladin attack the city? Our sources say that Saladin first approached the city from the west. On the western side of Jerusalem, the modern gate is what we call the Jaffa Gate. Right? It is the most prominent entrance to the city, and attacking from the west has some advantages, but it has some major disadvantages. In particular, there is something called the Tower of David in Jerusalem, which is a towering structure that dominates the western side of the wall. And what the sources indicate is that Saladin got to the western side, looked at the defenses, thought of a couple ideas, and then figured out pretty quickly, this isn't going to work. So then he moves his army to the north side of the city, which traditionally is the spot where Jerusalem's walls are almost always breached, from the north. And so he goes up from the north, and he unleashes an artillery barrage. He sends waves of attackers at the wall. He uses battering rams. A lot of the things that you see in the movie, he does use. But there's a couple issues. Right? Number one is this weapon right here. That is a trebuchet, but specifically known as a counterweight trebuchet, in which you use a counterweight on the other end of the arm to propel the projectile by essentially whipping the arm around a pivot point. People have studied these things incessantly. I have several friends who are historians of artillery technology. This is all they do, and sometimes they rebuild them. I got to shoot one of these in Denmark once, which was an exciting experience, lobbing flaming balls of fire into the Baltic Sea. I recommend it if you can ever get a chance to get over that. Seriously, it was awesome, right? But there's a real question about whether this technology actually existed in 1187. The best historians of trebuchet technology, frankly, do not know. The sources don't reveal to us whether or not it was this sort of trebuchet or whether it was something we call a traction trebuchet, in which you have a team of pullers who are pulling on ropes in order to project the ordnance. So that's a little slip up. And you know what? I'm going to forgive Ridley Scott that. I'm going to let him have that, because honestly, we don't know. He could actually be right. I don't think he is, but I can't say either way. So I saw that, I said, oh yeah, trebuchets. I was a bit dismayed by the number of these devices. Dozens and dozens of counterweight trebuchets firing hundreds of projectiles per minute. You simply do not have that rate of fire in medieval warfare. You don't have that many devices. They take a long time to load. I've loaded them, and they take a long time to load. And usually, I think every time we did it, and it was historians loading, you should have seen it, it was hilarious. Usually one of us got hurt. I mean, as we're doing it, right? Because we don't know what we're doing, right? So the artillery, quite suspect. But I think I'll give him that. The worst one is the wall breakthrough. Now, one of Saladin's emirs comes to him and says, I have found a weak spot on the wall. He says, if we attack through the St. Christopher Gate, that's the weak spot. Instantly, my gears go up, because there is no St. Christopher Gate in Jerusalem. Now, that's a strange thing. We know all the names of the gates of Jerusalem in the Middle Ages. Why would you make one up? I don't understand. But that's why I'm not in Hollywood. I'm in Kansas City, right? When the army comes to the wall and is effecting the final breakthrough, and it's very dramatic, Balian is on the inside, and they're all preparing, and they say, okay, we're going to do this, right? The final explosion that you see comes as projectiles shot from those counterweight trebuchets sling forward and punch a huge hole in the wall, and then there's a lot of fighting and a lot of dead bodies, right? Again, very strange. The Christian sources for the siege of Jerusalem in 1187 and the Arabic sources all indicate that the wall was not breached with artillery. It was breached by sappers, by tunnelers who were going underneath the wall. They tunneled under the wall, They propped up the stones with wood, smeared them with pitch and naphtha, set it on fire, and the wall came tumbling down. I think that's pretty dramatic, personally. You're standing there, and some dude's up top, right, and all of a sudden the wall just falls out underneath him, right? A big crash with all the smoke and the flames and all of this. Instead, the director decides, no, it's got to be a catapult shot because that just looks awesome. Okay, fine. Again, it's not something that I think I'm really going to get very torn up about, but interesting that for things that we have pretty good sources for, that you would depart so easily from them. A fake gate and a fake breakthrough of a wall. Okay, but cinematically it could still be very good. Those are the oops moments that came to my mind. A little more serious, we move to the what were they thinking? First, I mentioned the Battle of Hattin, the most famous battle of Saladin's career, routinely called a decisive battle in the Middle Ages, although some scholars have challenged this lately. You see here the path of the Christians moving down from the city of Acre and the path of Saladin's forces coming in from beyond the Jordan. I don't need to rehash the battle. It's quite famous, and I will say quite shattering for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They lose probably between 18 and 20,000 soldiers at this battle, which is most of their army. And once that Jerusalem army is wiped out, as I mentioned, Saladin can hit the coastline here, and then he can drive south to Jerusalem. What really struck me as odd about this is a very famous battle. This is Saladin's best moment. You would think that you would want to get this as right as possible, right? So you see on the map where the army is coming from Acre. For some reason in the movie, the Crusaders leave from Jerusalem. They muster their forces in Jerusalem to the south, and then march up, I presume, along the Jordan and through the valley, and then over here. I'm not sure why. It's so obviously wrong to get a campaign piece like that erroneous. I don't understand why they did it. In fact, the city of Acre itself doesn't feature in the movie. You see Marseille, where the ships leave from the European continent. You see Balian land on the seashore. You see Jerusalem. You see Ibelline. They spend a lot of time in his town. They don't actually spend much time in Acre. Acre is a very important city at the time. It's not the biggest city, but it's certainly a prime staging spot for reinforcements coming from the west. Those ships are sailing into the Acre port, as well as Jaffa down to the south. So I'm not sure why they have the mistake. I just don't know what they were thinking there. Another bit has to do with Saladin's army. Twice in the movie, they make the point that Saladin had crossed the Jordan with 200,000 soldiers. Oh, yeah, okay. Sorry, I hit something here. 200,000 soldiers. Such armies were absolutely unheard of in the Middle Ages. They simply did not exist. The biggest army we know for the Crusades, we think, during the First Crusade was between 60 and 70,000 soldiers. And that is really maxing it out, and a lot of those people were probably camp followers. They weren't all soldiers. 200,000 is unbelievable. From my research, it seems that Saladin at any given time could muster tops maybe 30,000, maybe 30,000. So why make it 200,000? Why go out on a limb and do that? So that it seems like some world-beating force, right? So that it seems so irresistible that Balian has no choice but to make certain decisions, or the Marshal of Jerusalem has no choice to flee the scene where he says, you can defend Jerusalem, we're toast, right? Because how could you beat off 200,000 soldiers? That's a Napoleonic army. That's not a medieval army. There simply were not that many soldiers to go around. So in terms of military history, that's a pretty big blunder to get that number wrong. And to get it wrong by so many degrees is very strange. I would say medieval decisive battles in general, many of them, when you look at them, don't even have these kinds of numbers. So earlier today, I was talking to colleagues about the Battle of Agincourt, right? Agincourt, which is as famous, if not more famous than Hattin, probably had, less than 9,000 soldiers on the English side. That's a medieval army. That's the size of what we're talking about. Saladin had a few more, but we don't want to make this bigger than what it was. So it's very strange to me that the crowning moment of Saladin's career would be so wrong. The armies coming from the wrong places, the numbers being so wrong, and then not showing the action. It seems to me like a missed opportunity. If you were going to have a great gladiator type movie, this would be the battle to center on to really get right. And instead, not much about it is right at all. Another moment, this has to do with the love scene, right, or the love scenes. Everybody loves romance in movies, right? So we have Balin of Ibelin, and we have Sibylla, Queen Sibylla, who is the sister to Edward Norton, Baldwin IV, who is the leper king, and he has that beautiful silver mask so you can't see what he's doing, right? And he speaks in this very weak and frail voice, right? When Baldwin IV dies, Sibylla is going to become the queen in name, but she is on the search for a husband because the expectation is that the husband would rule. And so that part of the movie where she is considering her options, that is true, right? But I can tell you one thing, she does not choose Orlando Bloom. She does not. She does not choose the Lord of Ibelin. She's going to marry Guy de Lusignan, which, of course, the movie does showcase, right? But there is no happy ending for this woman. She has a son, Baldwin V, and he will die early on. And in the director's cut, they make up this story about her poisoning her own son to spare him from the brutality of leprosy, which is not right. But she's not going to have a happy ending because in the movie, this is a scene from Ibelin where they're just hanging out and roasting marshmallows and having a good old time together. But at the end of the movie, Balin is back in his blacksmith shop back in France. And he passes up an opportunity to go on crusade again, and you see her riding on a horseback. She's come to France with him. She's given up her crown in Jerusalem, moved to France, and is married a common blacksmith. It's a wonderful story. I'm not sure why Balin would have given up all of his lands in Ibelin. It's a nice location down by the city of modern-day Ashkelon. Strategically important. You could get money out of it, but apparently he just wanted to beat swords for a living. That's fine, and Balin can do whatever he wants. But Sibylla's not going to be there to join him because Sibylla died in 1190. And she didn't die in France. She died outside the city of Acre in a siege camp built in front of that city by the army of the Third Crusade. Sibylla was a participant in the Third Crusade. She went there to Acre with her husband. She got very sick in the summer in the fall of 1190, and that is where she died. Right? So no going back to France, no romance. I'm very sorry. Balin himself actually married somebody with a lot more money than her. He married Maria Comnena, who was a Byzantine princess. Now you're living, right? There you go. Here's the note. I jotted this down from this is a metrical verse from a passage from a metrical chronicle of the Third Crusade written by a Norman jongleur. Quote, just after the end of August 1190, the Queen of Jerusalem died among the army. This was a sad moment for a woman of her age, as she was considered to be a worthy lady. May God have mercy on her soul. So she's kaput, no happy ending. And here's why I put this under the what the category instead of a mere oops. The death of Sibylla has tremendous political repercussions. She had been married to Guy de Lusignan. As soon as she dies, his claim to the throne is instantly disputed. And it's disputed by a man named the Marquis of Montferrat. His name is Conrad. Conrad makes a claim on the throne. Now, Conrad had married Sibylla's half-sister, a woman by the name of Isabella. And he claims, well, Sibylla is dead now, but I'm married to her half-sister. I'm the king of Jerusalem. At which Guy de Lusignan has to put up his own fight, and they argue back and forth between them. Right? Conrad himself doesn't last very long. In 1192, he's murdered by a member of what's called the Nizari, a group of Shia assassins who sometimes allegedly sat around in the mountains smoking hashish and then going out and slipping knives into people's rib cages. So Conrad, the man who wanted to be king and marries her half-sister, he dies, and then after Conrad is dead, a man by Henry, the Count of Troyes, is going to come, and he will become the king of Jerusalem. And guess who will serve this new king, Henry of Troyes? Balin of Ibelin. He will stay in the Holy Land, serving the new king of Jerusalem, having children, and there he dies. So the whole going back to France, it actually obscures a very important political story that has to do with the succession of a royal throne in a very tumultuous period in which you see Christian infighting that is incredibly deadly and deleterious to their own war aims. So skimming it over, making it a nice happy romance, it makes for a nice storybook ending, but historically it is problematic and it does actually obscure the real history of what happened in the 1190s. Uh-oh. Now we're on the bad stuff. These are the things that took the bulk of attention in the critical reviews. Right? Here we have a statement by the Hospitaller, our anonymous medical do-gooder. Right? I put no stock in religion. I don't like the word religion. Right? I've seen too much religion. It's all about holiness. That's what it's about. It's all about helping those, and it's all about being good. There's nothing wrong with the second part of this. You see this in the devotional and in the pastoral literature of the time. But this, the idea that a member of a military religious order would eschew religion, it simply would not have happened. Jonathan Riley Smith comes down very hard on this bit of the movie because the idea that it's pushing is really a modern idea. The notion that religions are set systems with rules and that those rules control people and they obscure true faith. And in the modern age, okay, make your case for it, but people simply didn't talk like that in the Middle Ages. This is a revealed religion. It is imagined to be the truth. And to have a member of the Hospitallers actually say this would have been something else. And we don't have records indicating that these sorts of things were said by these sorts of monks. Right? So the movie has been criticized for that, for taking religion and imparting really a modern anachronistic notion on it. That it's not about the rules, it's just about doing the right thing. That is a modern concept. Right? And so there you're really moving away from the medieval frame of mind. And then you have God wills it. Deus lo vult, the very famous charge of the Crusades. It's said in 1095 at the Council of Clermont. Let's go to the east and fight. And throughout this movie, you have these Christians who Ridley Scott really paints as kind of the unthinking, bloodthirsty types. All they want to do is put an army together, go to war, and kill everybody, right? And when anybody disagrees with them, it's God wills it, God wills it, God wills it, right? So there's a corruption there as well, right? We are claiming that God has put his blessing on us, right? The God wills it part, yes, you do see it in the sources sometimes. And I have no doubt that there were Knights Templar who did kind of get their back up about these things and want to go fight. And there were some who got very frustrated when the action was lacking. And so I can imagine this is true. But what's interesting about this, the more I thought about it, I'm like, okay, good, God wills it. I see what the director is doing. I see this. Okay, I got it. For those of you who saw the movie, did you ever once hear the word jihad? It's not in there. I searched and searched in vain for the word jihad. Where is the Islamic counterpart to God-desiring warfare? Because I've read every single source for the Third Crusade, and I can tell you the word is in a lot of them. And I'm talking about the Arabic sources, right? There are frequent calls to holy war. Saladin himself is called a champion of jihad. He is extolled in the poetry, both before Hattin and after. First, the idea that you have to go on jihad and liberate Jerusalem. Second, that you are the jihadi champion compared to great Islamic warriors in the past. And yet you never hear any Muslim in the movie use the word jihad. Right? And this is where I fall back to what Riley Smith and Tom Madden were talking, and I start to really sympathize with their accounts. Because it is painting a very deliberate picture. One side believes they are fighting to God, for God, and are using God as an excuse for their murderous deeds. Whereas the other side is fighting for what? Reason, just cause, legitimate grievances, things that we can empathize with, and so you end up with an imbalance. In my study of the Crusades, what I found is that both sides are going at each other with religious motivation, and it's near constant. It's not the only reason they're fighting, but it is a primary reason they're fighting. Over and over again, Saladin will say things like, well, you know, this is not good for the cause of Islam. Or if he's getting attacked, he'll jump on a horse and he'll say, huzzah, huzzah, on for Islam, on for jihad. Right? The soldiers are listed as jihadi and mujahideen in the sources. And so this is a thing where I think there's definitely an aim of the movie to make some kind of a political statement. And so I really start to sympathize with those critics who have gone at that. I think it's an important thing. And then the other one, the other oh no moment, has to do with Saladin himself. Whenever we talk about Saladin, you have to decide, am I talking about the historical Saladin, or am I talking about the legendary Saladin? Because his legend is bigger than his history. Ever since Saladin died, he has been celebrated in the East and the West as someone who is just, someone who is merciful, someone who is wise. a proud ruler, a good ruler. So much so that if you read Dante's Inferno, you'll find that Saladin is in hell, but he's not really in hell. He's in limbo. He's not burning for being a heretic. He's in limbo, just kind of lost. The idea being that, well, but he was one of the good Muslims. And on it goes, all the way up into the present, and you can find former President Jimmy Carter speaking in the Middle East and extolling the virtues of Saladin. All right? So you have a legend there, and this movie buys into that legend big time. And one of the ways you can tell is at the aftermath of the Battle of Hattin. Here you see Renaud de Chatillon getting his just desserts. There's a scene where Saladin hands a cup of ice to Guy, and then Reynard takes the ice and he's refreshing himself. And Saladin gets so worked up by it, he just pulls out a knife and he just slashes him across the throat. It's satisfying. It makes Saladin look not like a good guy, but he's sort of a ruler who is fed up with the antics of this man who we all know is a mass murderer. In reality, what did Saladin do? Well, after Battle of Hattin, there were hundreds of Knights Templar and Hospitaller who had been captured. They had been captured by Saladin's emirs, by his subordinates. Saladin ransomed their lives. He paid the emirs so that these people now became his prisoners. And then he gave those prisoners over to a group of Sufi Muslims who were there. Now, Sufis, nonviolent, had dedicated themselves to pacifism, apparently went up to Saladin and said, you know, this one time, can you give us this one time? Can we kill these people for you? And according to one of the Arabic sources, Saladin agreed. He had a pavilion set up where he would eat that cup of ice, and he watched with a smile on his face as formerly pacifistic Sufi Muslims slashed the throats of hundreds of Knights Templar and Hospitaller. That's very different than what went on here. Here, Saladin can be looked at a leader who is trying to do the right thing. He's won a battle, he gets his just desserts, and he's had it with an implacable foe. The other one has Saladin as, well, you can fill in the blanks, right? What do we want to call somebody who executes all his prisoners of war? And so there's been a debate about Saladin lately that takes it away from the legend, and historians have started scrutinizing this a bit more and saying, is he really as good as we chalk him up to be? Here's another example of that. At the end, Balian surrenders the city. He makes a deal with Saladin so that everyone can leave Jerusalem. And that's a quote, I took it from IMDb. All will safely be escorted to the sea. All the citizens of Jerusalem can leave in safety. Not true. The deal that is worked out is that citizens can leave Jerusalem if they ransom themselves. 10 dinars per man, 5 dinars per woman, and 1 dinar per child. If you have the money, you can walk away free. If you don't have the money, you better find the money. Now, Saladin did let several thousand go who did not have the money, so there is a generosity there. But what we know is that there were a lot of people in Jerusalem who could not ransom themselves, and so they were stuck. We don't know the exact number. One Arabic source says 11,000. Others say 7,000, 8,000. So it depends on which source you read, but clearly 7,000, right? What happened to these people? Did they just live a life of tranquility in the New Jerusalem? And it depends on who you read. One historian who we have, his name is Imad al-Din Isfahani. He was a close friend of Saladin. He was not a witness to the siege of Jerusalem, but he witnessed the aftermath of it. And he wrote essentially a biography of the Sultan that the Sultan personally reviewed. So this is a guy who knows Saladin very well and wrote about it. This is what Isfahani wrote about those people who could not ransom themselves. Quote, talking particularly about the women. How many well-guarded women were profaned? How many queens were ruled, and nubile girls married, and noble women given away, and miserly women forced to yield themselves, and women who had been kept hidden stripped of their modesty, and serious women made ridiculous, and women kept in private now set in public, and free women occupied, and precious ones used for hard work, and pretty things put to the test, and virgins dishonored, and proud women deflowered, turbulent men able to give vent to their passion. He's describing a mass rape at Jerusalem, a rape of the surviving female prisoners. You never hear this sort of thing in the standard treatments of Saladin. Even if you were to pick up the academic biographies of this man, that sort of passes. Some have written it off as a flourish, as an exaggeration. I tend to read it as a historical accuracy. So there's this legend of Saladin that wants to buy into he was very generous, he was very good, and I will grant you there are numerous things throughout his life where he indeed was, where he was merciful, where he was generous, where the legend is real. But then there are other places where not so much. And one of the critiques that has been made of the movie is that it paints this overly glamorous picture of Saladin and obscures him for what he really was, a very practical wartime ruler in the Middle Ages who made choices, some good, some bad, and many that we as modern people would look back and be repelled by, but which in the time, perfectly normal. So, a few oops, a few I don't understands, and a few real problematic things. At the end, let's get to the good stuff. What does the movie get right? The movie gets this right, and it gets it right over and over again, and that is the idea of religious diversity in the Holy Land. Here you see some of the quotes. Balian talking with Godfrey, his fake father, right? We're all going to live together, Christians and Muslims. We're going to do all this. Hospitaller says, look, we're going to all pray here together. Muslims can pray here, Jews can pray here, Christians can pray here. Balian at the end says none of these things matter. The Western Wall, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, no one has claim, all have claim. Everybody has claim in the city. It sounds a little preachy when you watch it. Right? But Balian in this case is absolutely right. That is what Jerusalem's story is in the 12th century. It is a city of religious toleration, a city of religious diversity. There are lots of events that you can pin to, and I've been researching these lately, where you see Christians granting rights to Muslims, Muslims granting rights to Christians, and Christians and Muslims granting rights to Jews. Over and over again in the city. The first crusade, which featured a massacre of the city's inhabitants, happened in 1099. By the time you get to 1116, people are being welcomed back into the city. First, the Eastern Christians, the Copts, the Melkites, the Jacobites, the Georgians. 2 years later, Muslim traders are back, and by 1138, Muslims are praying on the Temple Mount with the permission of the King of Jerusalem. One in particular, by the name of Usama, actually goes to Al-Aqsa Mosque, where he's welcomed by his Templar friends. They embrace each other, they say, how's it going? And then they actually ask him, they're like, hey, would you like to pray to Mecca? Do you want to do your prayers? Why don't you go over here and pray? All right? We know that you actually have not just one Muslim praying on the Temple Mount, but there was actually a spot where a sundial had been erected south of the Dome of the Rock, and Muslims would gather there on a daily basis to do their prayer. By the time you get to 1165, we have indications of Jewish prayer at the Western Wall being allowed by the King of Jerusalem. In 1182, we get a document telling us about the functions of the Hospital of St. John, and it says specifically, all will be cared for, Muslims, Jews, and Christians. Saladin takes the city in 1187, and this ball keeps on rolling. Jewish residency returns. Before, they had only been allowed to rent lodging. Now they could actually move into the city. Christian pilgrims are welcomed, even after the Third Crusade. We have massive numbers of Jewish pilgrims arriving in 1209. The most famous is called the Aliyah of the pilgrims, the going up of 300 Jews from Provence. And then in 1229, the most shocking bit of all, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II concludes a truce with this man here, Sultan Al-Kamil of Egypt. This is Frederick II, this is Al-Kamil. They meet in a room together, an extraordinary meeting between two monarchs, no advisors present, just the two of them hammering out a deal. And the deal they hammer out is this. Frederick gets the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and gets to administer the city of Jerusalem. Al-Kamil gets the Temple Mount, and only Muslim prayer will be allowed on the Temple Mount. That's in 1229, my friends. The deal that only Muslims will pray on the Temple Mount. Do you know how long that lasted? All the way up until the present day. In fact, in 1967, during the Six-Day War, when Moshe Dayan takes the Temple Mount and is having a discussion with Rabbi Shlomo Goren, the rabbi suggests maybe we should burn down the Muslim sites. Take care of them now. We own the spot. And Moshe Dayan says, no, status quo. It remains as it ever was. Now, I've read through Moishe Dayan's memoirs. He makes no mention of Frederick II, the Treaty of Jaffa, or 1229. I don't know if he knew anything about it. But in 1967, he was confirming what had been, by then, centuries of tradition. Muslims pray on the Mount. Christians pray at the Sepulchre. Jews pray at the Western Wall. That has been going on since the mid-12th century. And so when I step back and look at Kingdom of Heaven, what I think is, here's a movie that gets so many things wrong. Easy things, things that it shouldn't have gotten wrong. Fish in a barrel. You don't say there's 200,000 soldiers in an army, right? You don't create a new picture of Jerusalem so it doesn't look like the old Jerusalem. I don't know why you make those kinds of mistakes. But I would argue that this message, because it comes through so strongly, even though it's a little preachy, even though it's been accused of having some sort of modernist, let's just all get along agenda, it's actually historically correct. This is a city where all three Abrahamic faiths lived and worshiped together for centuries and centuries and centuries. And the most important bit is who grants the rights to do that. It's Saladin granting rights to Jews, a Muslim giving Jews right to pray. It's Frederick II, a Christian, giving Muslim the rights to pray. It's not an army taking the city and it's deciding for themselves, we get exclusive rights. It's being generous to people of the other faiths. And I think the movie is very canny about this, and I think it's great, because if you walk away from it thinking that, you know, maybe there was a time in Jerusalem where there was at least a hope that everyone could actually get along, that's the real history. And I think that's the lasting contribution of the movie. I expect there are academics who would disagree with me about this. And so in closing, what I would say is, when you watch this movie, when you watch any historical movie, I suggest maybe thinking about it in those terms. You can get swept away in the details and all of the little issues, all the problems that just drive you crazy. Can you, at the end of it, step back, take it in holistically, try to understand what the movie is trying to say? What story is it trying to tell? And I would suggest if it gets that story right, then you're watching something that's worth your time. And at the end of the day, if you don't like the movie, you know what the old saying is, the book is always better. So if you're interested, these are titles I would recommend if you want to get the true story of what was going on in the period of Kingdom of Heaven. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. We do have time for a couple questions, if anybody wants to use the microphones here. I would maybe ask one for starters. Did Ridley Scott basically take the same tack in Gladiator? Can you compare wasn't that also, there's some ambivalence about, there's some accuracy, but for the most part, he took a lot of liberty with history. Can you see how he operated in the same vein in each of those films?
I think there's similarities. The problem there is the grand message he pitches at the end is sort of wrong. The Roman people are going to bring the Republic back, whereas that is not the attitude in the late 2nd century AD. But I think much of that movie has been celebrated in terms of some historical accuracy, in terms of getting the emperor right, getting his son right, and some of those elements. What I typically hear, especially from my students, is the fighting and the drama and the dialogue is so good in that movie, and the character development is so good that we don't really care if the end of the story is correct. Particularly that where Maximus is in the center and he says, "Show me your face and tell me your name," and he says, "I'm father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife," and everybody says, "Oh, that's amazing," right? So I'm not sure his grand message comes across in that one, but again, I think there are blips in there, and then there are things that are correct. With movies, it's tricky on whose advice you're going to take. Most of these movies have historical consultants. The question is will you take the word of the consultant, or will you take the word of somebody else who's giving another point of view?
And final from me, so these are titles to read. Are there movies about the Crusades, other movies about the Crusades that you would recommend, and how would you fit Kingdom of Heaven in with them?
In terms of movie of the Crusades, I think if you really want to see one that gets to the real drama and the real crisis of faith, that that people went through. You know, I went to the Holy Land. I thought Jesus would return when we took Jerusalem. He didn't come back. What does that mean to me? What does that mean to my worldview? The one I would recommend is The Seventh Seal. And it's in black and white, and it is old, but it has the famous chess match between the knight and death. And that tension, the idea of a man trying to come to grips with who he really is, that's the one I would recommend. It's not going to have the action, though. So if you're looking for a swashbuckling thriller, that's certainly not the one I want. But if you want to talk about introspection, faith, what it means to fight for God, and what do you do when the fight is over, that's the movie I would recommend.
Part of the movie, you didn't address it, and maybe it didn't bother you so much, but the one thing that bothered me is the idea of this class system that it seemed like Ridley Scott had to make a huge editorial comment that somehow or another a blacksmith has the reflexive skills of a lifetime of knights training for war, and somehow or another that just automatically fits into that system when he arrives in the Holy Land. And then that completely hokey scene where he knights every male in the city of Jerusalem under siege. He did knight, 25 or 50 men-at-arms in that city when Saladin had it under siege. But this idea that every man among you, teenager or whatever, bow, and you are now knights. It's just, yeah, that was so hokey. I don't know, maybe you didn't feel that strongly about it. But.
No, I totally agree. It's, yeah, hokey's a good word for it. It's very inspiring to say, oh, wow, he's a man of the people. And I think that is a sub-theme throughout the movie, that Balian is sort of this man of the people. There's that scene where he goes back to Ibeline and he says, well, we have no water, and he's out there and they're digging a well. He's out there with the peasants, you know, and they're all playing together. He's like, you know, no, a lord doesn't do that, right? And you don't knight the entire population of a city. And you know, a knight's training it's a title, but this is something you train for your entire life. You grow up learning how to ride a horse and how to work with a lance and how to sword fight. The weapons of a knight are incredibly expensive. Most people can't afford them. And so the idea that you go from one to the other, and you're right, because first he becomes a knight, and then he defeats a champion of Islam when he gets to the Levantine coast, right? And then he has this kind of built-in authority over his old estate, and now he's charging into battle, and he apparently has no fear whatsoever. Yeah, it's a little over the top, for sure. Yeah.
Well, John, thank you so much, and thank all of you for joining us tonight. Hope you all have a good evening. Thanks again.